some people in this world who know lots of stuff about different subjects, but you'd never know it. You'd never know it by looking at them or listening to them. And then there are others who know a little bit about something, but to hear them tell it, you think they know it all from A to Z. There are some people who have a good track record when it comes to being right. And others, bless their hearts, get it wrong almost every time. Most of us fall somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. Being right about something and knowing that you're right can be an ego trip and can give us a sense of power. When I am right and you are wrong, I'm up here and you're down there. I win, you lose. So the thinking goes. What's even better is when I am right and you are wrong, I can back you into a corner. And then I can use those favorite 4 little words. I told you so. It's a way for me to have power over you. One of my favorite television shows is the 1990s sitcom, Everybody Loves Raymond. Do you know the show? I will watch episode, as Gene can attest, I will watch episode after episode on TV Land, and even though most of them I've seen about 6 times, I'll still laugh at the same places every time. It is the story of a family, the Barones. Raymond and his wife Deborah and their 3 kids live next door to Raymond's parents, Frank and Marie, and Raymond's brother, Robert. Marie, the mother of Ray, and Deborah, his wife, have a competitive and sometimes contentious relationship. Marie is the quintessential meddling mother-in-law who feels superior to Deborah in almost every way, and in her passive-aggressive put-down manner lets Deborah know that she does not measure up as a cook or a housekeeper or a mother. Marie believes herself right in every argument with a, I know what's best, but if you don't want to take my advice, well, that's fine. Do whatever you want, dear. Don't mind me. In one episode, Marie asked Deborah about a favorite family heirloom, a canister, that she has brought to their house with cookies in it. And Deborah says to her she's already returned the canister to her. And Marie, with a condescending look, says, well, could you please just look around for it? For I know in all this clutter things can easily get misplaced. Well, Deborah this time decides not to back down, convinced that she has already returned the canister and that Marie was this time wrong. She confronts Marie to the point that Marie, who never backs down or never apologizes, says, oh, Deborah, even though I love that canister, you mean so much more to me than that canister. Don't worry about it. I'm sorry. I never meant to doubt you or hurt you. Well, when Marie says that to Deborah, she's taken aback. Marie has never done anything like that. And they hug, and Marie goes home. And Deborah feels like that for once she was right, and Marie was wrong. And now Deborah has the power. And then Allie, the 8-year-old daughter, comes walking into the kitchen, holding in her arms the canister. The rest of the show is the whole family's attempt to get the canister back to know-it-all right every time Marie without her realizing that she's been right again and everyone else will have to eat crow and hear about it for years. Yes, dear, but you remember the canister. In our scripture today, not the one that Dawn read, but another of our lectionary scriptures from today, Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth. Paul, in that passage, is addressing a question in a letter he had received from the church, asking him to tell them what is right and what is wrong. The issue before them is a question that may not seem all that relevant to those of us who enjoy hamburgers or grilled steaks, or fried chicken, or pork chops and gravy nearly every day, or those of us who go to churches where almost every dinner is centered around something that will satisfy the carnivores, the meat eaters among us. I think I told you before, several years back, Jean and I decided that we would become vegetarians because of our concern for how animals are treated. And for about 4 months, our conscience overruled our stomachs. But then we caved in. The issue brought to Paul by the Corinthians was about eating meat that had been previously used in pagan rituals. Episcopal minister Katerina Whitley writes about this situation. The Corinthian believers of the first century, surrounded as they were by so many gods, and the different cultures and worship of various people who thronged to that rich city, were confused about what Christ asked of them and by what they had learned while living in a multicultural city. They had written to Paul to ask a variety of questions, and among them was the question of their diet. Was it proper to eat the meat of animals after those animals had been sacrificed to a pagan god? This was practiced widely in the Roman world. They would offer the whole animal as sacrifice at their pagan temple, but then the meat would be sliced and sold in the marketplace. Now, some of the new Christians who felt superior because they had knowledge, they were educated, they felt free to buy that meat and eat the meat. Others, though, afraid that they would fall into the sin of idol worship, would refrain from eating meat and would eat only vegetables. Today, of course, they would be praised as being vegetarian, but in those days, food was scarce, and people who were knowledgeable were more concerned with feeding their families than with the niceties of the new religion that had its roots in the very old Hebrew traditions. The problem with Paul's congregation was that the educated ones made fun of the ones who refused to buy the meat. And from the Message translation, it says, the question keeps coming up regarding meat that has been offered up to an idol. Should you attend meals where such meat is being served or not? We sometimes tend to think that we know all we need to know to answer these kind of questions, but sometimes our humble hearts can help us more than our proud minds. We never really know enough until we recognize that God alone knows it all. Some people say, quite rightly, that idols have no actual existence, that there's nothing to them, that there is no God other than our one God, and that no matter how many of those so-called gods are named and worshipped, they still don't add up to anything but a tall story. They say, again, quite rightly, that there's only one God the Father, that everything comes from Him, and that He wants us to live for Him. And also they say there's only one Master, Jesus the Messiah, and that everything is for His sake, including us. And yes, that's all true. In strict logic, then, nothing happened to that meat when it was offered up to the idol. It's just like every other meat. I know that, Paul says, and you know that, but knowing isn't everything. If it becomes everything, then some people end up as know-it-alls who treat others as know-nothings. Real knowledge, Paul says, isn't that insensitive. we need to be sensitive to the fact that we're not all at the same level of understanding in all things. Some of you have spent your entire lives, he says, eating idol meat and are sure that there's nothing bad about it in the meat that becomes something bad inside of you. And imagination and conscience shaped under those conditions isn't going to change overnight. Paul, who probably would have eaten the meat because he knew that it would not defile him, had great compassion for members of the church who felt differently than he did. Paul was sensitive to being a stumbling block to a new Christian. He would do anything to support the weak in order not to cause one of them to be afraid or to be lost. Having learned from his Jesus that the who matters more than the what, that people matter more than rules or ideologies, Paul zeroed in on what built the congregation and disregarded what puffed up the congregation. Catarina Whitley says, today Paul probably would ask us church people, do you have a fine choir? Do you have a gorgeous building? Good for you. But do you also welcome the stranger? Do you open your doors and hearts to the hurting? Do you care for the poor and feed the hungry? Do you take care of what builds up the body of Christ? You see, when who matters more than what, it means we don't always get the satisfaction of having our ideas validated as the right ones, nor do we get to proclaim that those with whom we disagree are necessarily in the wrong. You see, when who matters more than what, we sacrifice the black and white world of winners and losers, and in humility, we acknowledge that we're all seeing things through a glass dimly. When who matters more than what, we care for and we help those who we may not understand, or whose behaviors we may not endorse, or whose ways we may not find acceptable. But when who matters more than what, we're able to keep the channels of communication open. Communication that leads to a deeper relationship. When who matters more than what, the healing love of God flows. And we never know how or when or where a life might be saved, or a heart might be changed, or a soul might be redeemed. We trust God then with those results. In the gospel reading for today from Mark chapter 1 that Dawn read, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue and his ideas are being warmly received. He's impressing the crowd, when the story says he was suddenly interrupted by a man who was deeply disturbed, who started hollering out. Now, having been in that situation myself a few times, what do? Do you ignore the man and hope that maybe the ushers will quiet him down or quietly get him out of the room? Do you call the police and let the authorities handle the disruptor? What do? Well, Jesus stops right there in the middle of his sermon and he addresses the man and the man's needs. Right then. Right there. Was it the right thing to do? What about his sermon? What about all those ideas he had to teach and all those points he wished to make? Would he be able to get back on topic? What about the dignity of the worship service? Was it not lost? I don't know. It's a hard call. But Jesus chose to put who? The value of this man over what? Jesus chose to put the man who is in need of God's healing over the propriety and protocol of the moment over getting the worship service completed as planned. There are so many issues out there in the world today that have found their way into the life of God's church. Issues that divide people of equally good character. People with strong opinions and valid ideas on all sides. Who is right? Who is wrong? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Who matters? Recently, movements have arisen around that question, who matters? Do black lives matter? Do blue lives matter? Do women who've been sexually assaulted matter? Do immigrants, even those who don't have their legal papers, some who may have came to this homeland with their parents 20 years or more ago, do they matter? Some may came knowing the only way they could save their families from hunger and poverty was to risk crossing our southern border illegally. Do those folks matter? Do folks living in our rural areas, in small towns with shuttered businesses, folks seemingly forgotten in economic recovery times, do they matter? Do people in Africa and Haiti and the Gaza Strip, places in the world where disease and hunger and war still threaten widespread loss of human life and much suffering, do those folks matter? Do sick people who have no insurance and need health care matter? Do folks who have a mental illness or struggle with addiction matter? As Christians, we are taught to believe our lives matter. Jesus died for us. Our lives matter. But what about those people who claim other faith stories? What about people who say they are of the Muslim faith? Do their lives matter to God? What about Hindus or Buddhists or people who don't have a faith group as their own? Do their lives matter? Have you ever seen on TV or read the story of the Muslim teenager Malala Yousafzai? Her story she tells in an autobiography, I Am Malala. She was 11 when the Taliban took over the northwestern part of Pakistan where she lived with her family. And they had bombed everything, power stations, a ski lift, hotels, funerals, over 400 schools. The Taliban had conducted public whippings and hangings. They had beheaded over 1,400 fellow Muslims. The police were so terrified of being murdered that the police took out newspaper advertisements to announce that they had quit the force so that the Taliban would not come after them. The Pakistani army eventually rooted them out, or so they said. The trouble continued. Malala's father received death threats, which wasn't a surprise. He was an outspoken political activist who had founded a major school that educated girls. He even kept a copy of Martin Niemöller's famous prayer in his pocket, a prayer that says, first they came for this group, and then they came for that group, and then they came, and then they came for me. At night, after everyone was asleep, Malala would get up and make sure all the doors and windows in the house were locked. At age 11, young Malala had emulated her brave father. She wrote a diary, and the British Broadcasting Corporation picked it up. It described life under the Taliban, and she gave interviews to Pakistani national television. The New York Times did a documentary about her. She won numerous academic awards, and she knew she wanted to be a politician. And when she was 15, In 2012, a Taliban gunman fired 3 shots at point-blank range at Malala as she rode home on a school bus, and 1 shot hit her, the other 2 wounded her 2 classmates. And after a miraculous recovery in England, the attempted murder catapulted her onto the stage of a global campaign, and on her 16th birthday, she spoke at the United Nations. And in October 2014, at the age of 17, she became the youngest recipient ever of the Nobel Peace Prize. On those scary nights when she double-checked all the doors and windows, Malala said she also prayed. She said, "At night I used to pray a lot. I'd pray to God, bless us, God. Bless us first, our Father and our family, then bless our street, and then bless our whole district, and then our whole country." And then she'd say, "No, God, please bless all Muslims." But then she said, "I realized I needed to begin praying, no, God, bless all human beings." Today, she's an outspoken critic of all forms of detestable practices done against all people, and particularly against women and girls. She's an advocate for the inherent dignity of all human beings. She has taken her place in this world and has stood for the idea that there is no them and there is only us. There is no them. There's only us. The what of our ideas we may have around politics or religion or culture, often divide the world into us and them, those people. But when who matters more than what, when we see the world through Jesus' eyes, there is no them. There's only us. My prayer is that South Main is and will always be a place where who you are matters much more than what you believe or do. And who are you? Who are you? If you ain't got that by now, there ain't no hope. Every Sunday, I ask you, who are you? Who are we? God's children, loved and redeemed and blessed, a child of God. So today,